Hi there. When working on projects, people will often create Gantt charts using Excel. This is because it's easy to create basic charts and share them with other members of the team without having to rely on additional and quite often expensive third-party software. The problem with these Gantt charts is by their very nature, they can be quite basic and sometimes don't get across the full message that the user is trying to portray in terms of the condition of the project. So how about this? A project Gantt chart in Excel that will allow you to change the start and end dates of tasks as well as show you the percentage complete and not complete. Will show you milestone tasks, shows you today's date, and also will allow you to change the start date of the Gantt chart to move the chart along as the project progresses. In this video, I'll show you how to create this Gantt chart file, a couple of different options for formula to create the chart area, and if you have Microsoft 365, I'll go through how you can use dynamic arrays to drastically reduce the number of formula on the sheet. Let's dive in and get started. We'll start with a master data sheet that contains 4 sections. The first is the milestone symbol, which allows us to change the symbol we want to use on the chart for a milestone task without having to change formula throughout the sheet. The second is whether we want to count a milestone as 0 or 1 days. This may vary depending on the project that you're working on. Next is 2 tables of data that will be used for drop downs in the left hand side of the chart. The first is for project status. The second is for the task lead assigned to that project. As they're tables, you can add additional data to the bottom and the table will expand. The next step is to lay out the format of your Gantt chart, and here I've already done all that. You can see we've got columns for the task name, the task lead, milestone, and what I've done is I've put a note in here that milestone in the chart area will be based on the end date only. It just helps users when filling out the form. We then have the task start date, the task end date. We'll be putting formula in to work out the duration in days and the duration in weekdays. The status will be a drop down as with task lead for the status of the project. Then we'll enter the percentage complete. At the top here, we've got a space for the project owner and the version number of the chart for when it's distributed. Today's date is worked out via a formula. Then we have a cell here for the first date on the chart. So depending on what you put in this cell will determine the date in column K. So what we've got in K6 is a formula that just refers to that date in E4. And then column L onwards, we're just incrementing the date by 1 each time. Now the formatting of this date, right click and select format cells, is a custom one which is just showing the day and then the month. So for those international viewers, just be aware that this is in a UK date format. Above that, we work out the day of the week by taking the text version of the date, just the day part of the text, and then we take the leftmost character of that text. And above that, we're just using the ISO week number formula to work out the week, which may be useful for your project. And above that, there's just a few cells that have been filled in to give a key for the user as to what the different parts of the Gantt chart signify. This will all be populated later on in the video through the use of conditional formatting and formula. On the left, I've put filters on columns B to J just so that users can filter out particular tasks in the project if they want to, such as those that are being handled by a certain task lead. They may want to see all tasks that are only milestones or all tasks of a certain status. And then just to finish up, in B1, there is a title that the user can change to the project name. When designing your layout, you'll want to pay particular attention to fonts because in certain areas of the chart, space will be at a premium. So for example, for task name and date headings, I've used a very narrow font, Arial Nova Condensed Light, which allows us to get the most out of the space available. There are columns within the input area of the chart that require or benefit from data validation. The first being the task lead, which is a drop down from the task leads table on the master data sheet. By going to data validation, you can see it's a list and the source is assigned to list, which is not the table itself, but a named range for the data in the tasks leads table, excluding the header. Go into formulas, name manager. You can see assigned to list refers to the assigned to table and the task leads column, excluding the title. This is because this way, when you add new data to the bottom, that name range will expand. Going back to data validation, in the milestone column, we have a drop down that chooses Y or N, yes or no. Data validation, it's a list and it's just a hard-coded source of Y or N, yes or no. The start date is formatted to only accept dates. You can't choose to just have any date if you want to validate to a date. So I've put it greater than or equal to the start of the current year. The end date is conditional formatted to a date, but that has to be greater than or equal to the start date. So it refers to column E on the same row to validate that the date is greater than the start date. So if I were to try and enter the date before, it will say end date must be the same or later than the start date. If I were to enter the 10th, that would be acceptable. These checks are dependent on the order that the data is entered. So for example, if I delete the start date, the end date is greater than nothing, so that's acceptable. So I could set that to the 10th. But if I were then to put the start date a day later, it doesn't flag up an error because the end date was entered first. You could potentially use some conditional formatting on the duration to highlight that you've got a negative duration. Otherwise, you're dependent on the user working through the columns and entering the data in a logical order. In the status column, as with the task leads, it's based on a drop down of a list of statuses that come from the master data sheet. Again, you can see that status list refers to a name range of the status entries in the statuses table. So as with the task leads, if more statuses were added, then the range would expand and be incorporated into the drop down. Final data validation on the sheet is the percentage complete. So if I go to data again, data validation, it's just allowing a decimal between 0 and 1, 0 being 0% and 1 being 100%. Moving forward into the next steps of creating the model, we're going to stick with these 3 records that I've entered as part of the data validation, entry and testing. Next, I'll enter the formula to calculate the duration in terms of absolute days and weekdays. So in the duration days column, we've got a formula that is looking at whether the project task is a milestone or not. If it's a Y and it is a milestone, it picks up the duration in days from the master data sheet, which we set as 0. So if I just go back to the master data sheet and set that as 1, you'll see that that's now pulled through a 1 for the duration of a milestone. Just set that back to 0. Where it's not a milestone task, the formula then looks at the start and end dates. So if a start date hasn't been entered, it will just put a 0 and the user will have to address that and put in the start date. If both the start and the end dates are populated, then the duration will be calculated as the end date less the start date plus 1. That's to show that even if the start and the end date are the same, the duration will be 1 day. For the weekdays duration, we're looking at whether the D7 entry for milestone is yes. If it is, we pick up the minimum of what we've decided on the master data sheet that a milestone should have a duration of, and the number of working days using the NETWORKDAYS.INTL formula. So you have your start date, your end date, and the 1 at the end is to show that we're choosing Saturdays and Sundays as non-working days. So in this instance, a milestone will have a duration of 0 because we'd set the master data option to be 0 working days for a milestone. Any other time, a milestone would have a duration of 1, unless, of course, it fell on a weekend, in which case it would be 0. If it's not a milestone, we work out the net working days using the NETWORKDAYS.INTL formula again, with the start date from column E, the end date from column F, and the option 1 to show that we want Saturday and Sunday to be considered as non-working days. So in this first instance, from the 9th to the 24th, it's a duration of 16 days, including the start and the end dates, but it is only 12 weekdays, including the start and end dates. Now we'll look at the formula that populate the grid of the Gantt chart, and we'll use cell K7 as the example because this will be copied to the right and down to fill the whole grid. We're using a series of nested if statements in this version, and be aware of the dollar signs throughout this because these are placed so that when the formula is copied to the right and copied down, it is still referring to the correct rows and columns accordingly, although I won't mention the dollar signs when talking through the formula. So we start by looking for the milestones. So if D7 is yes, it's a milestone, and the date at the top of column K, so K6, is the same as the milestone end date, then show the milestone symbol that we refer to on the master data sheet. In this instance, you can see you are getting the milestone symbol on this row here. Going back to K7, if it's not a milestone, then the formula moves on to the next section. So if it doesn't equal Y for a milestone, and the date at the top of the column is greater than or equal to the start date and less than or equal to the end date, then Excel deals with this next section of the formula. Otherwise, this cell lies outside of the date range for this task, so it puts a 0 in, and these numbers will become important when we look at the conditional formatting. If it's outside the range, it puts the 0. If the date falls within the range, then it looks to the percentage of completeness of the task. This date, K6, minus the start date, divided by the total duration in days, will give you a percentage of completeness. So obviously for K7, it's outside the range, so it's 0. But if we start looking further along, we are seeing other numbers. So in column O, the 9th is the first day of the task. Divided by the total duration will give you a percentage. And if that percentage is less than or equal to the percentage that we've said is complete, it will put a 2 in that cell. Otherwise, it's classed as an incomplete part of the task and it puts a 1 in. So in this case, we've said that the task is 50% complete. So the first half of the bar will be classed as complete and is flagged with a 2. The remainder of the bar is incomplete and is flagged with a 1. This is then wrapped in an if error function. You could wrap the whole nested if statement in the if error, but this seems to work fine. As I said, make sure you have your dollar symbols in the right place. Then you would copy this formula to the right and down to fill the entire grid. So Control R to copy right, Control D to copy down. From the Home tab, go to the Conditional Formatting icon and choose Manage Rules. Let's look at formatting rules for the entire worksheet. So to start with, we've got the formatting that applies to column E, the start date. So that's looking at where column D is a Y, as in it's a milestone, so it grays out the start date because we've already told users that the milestone is based on the end date only. You can see that's just using a formula to determine which cells to format, and it's where column D is a Y. The formula shown here being D7 is the first row in the range. So that formula actually applies down, which is why you can see for E9, it has worked correctly. The milestone is a Y, so E9 is grayed out. We then move on to the formatting that's been applied to the chart range, which in my instance is K7 to BH40. Format only cells that contain a cell value equal to 1 and apply this dark blue-green formatting for the incomplete section. Where the cell value is 2, it is a completed percentage of the task, so apply the green colour. Same rule as before, format only cells that contain cell value equal to 2 in this instance, and then apply the green formatting. Then we have the data bars in column J where we have the percentage complete. So for column J, from J7 to the bottom of the grid, we have format cells based on their values. So we're applying a data bar between the numbers of 0 and 1, which matches with the data validation rule that was put in earlier. We're filling with a solid fill of this pale green. We don't want the border. The bar direction is context, and as we're dealing with positive numbers, it will go from left to right. So this means that if we change this task from 50% complete to 15% complete, you can see a smaller bar in here to indicate the completeness, and 75% complete will show a larger bar. And as you've seen, the percentage complete changed on the task bar. Step this back. Go back into conditional formatting and look at the rest of the rules. The last two rules apply to the headings and to work out the current day. So in the section with the dates in rows 4 to 6, we've applied a formatting to show that if row 5, being the starting letter of the day of the week, if that is an S for the weekend in our instance, then format this date section at the top in a dark grey to indicate the weekends. Obviously, if you're in a country where Saturday and Sunday aren't the weekend, you would have to alter this accordingly and also deal with changing the argument on the networking days formula that we used in the duration as well. Finally, we're applying to the whole grid, including the date ranges at the top. If the date in row 6 equals today's date, this blue date at the top here, then to the whole column that is covering the chart, we're applying this hatched pattern format, and that means it's highlighting the current date of the week. This conditional formatting adds a lot more information and context to the chart, so we can immediately see at a glance where the completion status of tasks is. We can also immediately see where we are today in terms of the timeline, and the percentage finished and unfinished gives us some context when we look at the current date. So in both the examples that I've put here, if your project was on time, then your percentage complete should be in line with the current date or ahead. Both of these are ahead. If your percentage complete was behind your current date, it would obviously show the task is falling behind where it needs to be. So if I change the top one 15%, a team member looking at this chart would see that the training of users on row 7 is behind where we expect. We would expect this range of cells up to today's date to be green to show that the project was on schedule. The example I walked through used nested if functions to create the grid. I've also included in the example a sheet that has been done using the ifs statement. So I've wrapped it in the if error to deal with any anomalies, and then ifs deals with each instance separately. Criteria have to be expanded because you're not nesting things inside different functions. You're reliant on the AND function to deal with the multiple criteria of each step. For both of these, I've also recreated them using dynamic array functions that are available in the Microsoft 365 version of Excel. So if I go to the if version, you can see all this works in a very similar way. You've just expanded things to ranges rather than having to copy the formulas down. So you only have a formula in K7. There are no formula in the rest of the grid. You still have to have the conditional formatting across the whole grid. That has to be applied on a per cell basis. Using the dynamic functions, you can't use AND to check multiple criteria. So what you have to do is put each criteria within parentheses and then just use the asterisk or multiplier operator to chain multiple criteria together in lieu of an AND formula. In effect, it's working out if each part is true or false. True would have a value of 1, false would have a value of 0. If any of the criteria are false, the whole chain of criteria returns a 0 being false. This can also be applied to the date headers at the top. I've used the sequence function to return all the dates. So again, you only have a formula in column K. You don't have anything in the other columns. You can return the first letter of the day of the week by referring to the dynamic array in K6 using K6 hash. And then for the week number, again, refer to K6 hash being the dynamic array and wrap it in the ISO weeknum function. You can also use this in the duration columns. So for duration of days, you're using arrays. And for duration weekdays, the only quirk I would say here is that the NETWORKDAYS.INTL function doesn't currently play nicely with the dynamic arrays unless you apply an arithmetic function to each of the ranges. I'm looking at the dates here. So all I've done is added 0 to each range of dates and it's working fine. And the same for the ifs sheet. You have the ranges of cells. I'm not going to work through all the formula. They're very similar to the dynamic if sheet. And of course, you can download the example that I'm going to provide in the description and work through it at your leisure. If you need to expand the number of rows or columns on the sheet, then it will differ depending on whether you're using standard formula or dynamic arrays. If you're using the standard formula, I would recommend copying down the final row or the last column to expand your ranges. If you're using dynamic arrays, it's better to add additional rows or columns within the existing date range, and then the formula will expand accordingly. If you start adding them to the end of the range, the formula may not expand as expected. And that's the finished model. I hope you found this useful, and I'm sure you'll find ways of adding additional functionality that you want to use for your project. I'll share a link to my completed model in the video description. So thanks for watching.